Okay.
Oh my gosh.
Okay. So our topic for today is infant cognitive development. And so we've gone through the physical development of an infant from birth to about 1.5, 2 years old. And we've gone through the socio-emotional development where we focused on both theory of mind and we focused on attachment. And so now we want to look at the thought processes that infants go through and how those connect. And these are going to connect that physical development with that socio-emotional development that we've been talking about for the last couple of weeks. So again, when we look at those three theories that we went through, Jean Piaget was our cognitive example. But as you will see in this section, he is just one example of how we think infants' cognition develop. We're also going to talk about something that's called scaffolding theory, which deals with cognition as it's built in a child's mind due to the interaction it has with its environment, much like we talked about with socio-emotional development and that relationship. But we're going to add some more variables onto that when we're talking about cognition. Okay. And so let's just review really quick what Piaget was interested in. And we start with, he was a Swiss psychologist and he was interested in something called epistemology. When you all want, because I know everyone in this class is going to go to graduate school because you're all smart and awesome. You're going to be asked probably in your second year of your master's degree, what is your epistemology? Okay. And basically what they're asking is how do you know what you know? The study of epistemology is the study of knowledge. And so during your master's degree, you'll develop what's called your epistemology. That's your way of knowing. So for example, my main area of study is social psychology. And so my epistemology is much based on the interaction between the individual and the situation, and that our behaviors are created because of the situation we're in, not necessarily because of who we are as an individual. We all behave similarly in given situations. So that's my epistemology. Now, it doesn't always come out like that because here I'm teaching one of my favorite classes, which is human development. And we're looking at three areas of life. We're looking at biology, socio-emotional development, and cognition. So it doesn't all necessarily deal with my personal epistemology. It's dealing with the broader area. But John Piaget was interested in how do we develop this in early childhood? How do we get to know and understand the world in the sense of knowledge? Okay. And there were about three principles that he really came up with. The first one is intelligence is an active, constructive, and dynamic process, meaning that if you look at people way back when, we'll say, World War I is when we really started developing what are called intelligent tests. And intelligence tests, the ones that I'm speaking of really just measure like academic knowledge, like how you use rational thinking, how mathematics and language, and how do you understand that? And we know now that intelligence go way beyond just that academic area. But in the beginning, it was theorized that intelligence is set, that it is genetically set to a person. And so you and I, we have no, we could get to a certain level, but that was it. Okay. But what we have discovered since the development of these tests and going to other places and whatnot, is intelligence is not set. That instead, the fancy word that's used today is called what's called a growth mindset, meaning that as long as you know you can change and better yourself, you can. And some really good examples of the malleability of intelligence is I'm going to give two of them. The first one is let's say you start college with an average IQ. The average IQ is 100. And then you go clear through university, the 4 years, and get your bachelor's degree. Theoretically, when you leave university, you'll leave university with 115 IQ. Okay. And this goes not only to university, anyone, we've even tested this in, like, for example, trade schools. And so I don't want you to think, well, university makes me more intelligent. No, it's that active engagement that increases intelligence. Okay. The second example I'm going to give here in just a minute. Hold on, gang. I will be right back. Sorry about that, gang. Anyways, the second example of the malleability of intelligence actually has to do with bias and prejudice. Okay. And so, for example, it's been measured quite a bit that intercity poverty, low income Black students score a lot lower on cognitive and intelligence tests than, say, suburban white people. Okay. But the question is why? If intelligence is this thing that can be changed, why is it that probably an environmental contingency constrains some people's intelligence? Okay. Um, and so some psychologists at Stanford, I believe it was Stanford, um, decided to kind of do a test. Okay. And so they took some community college inner city Black students, and they randomly assigned them to what we'll call it weekend one and weekend two, or Saturday one, Saturday two. In that first Saturday, they brought them to the Stanford University. The reason why they chose Saturday is there's usually not a lot of students there. It's very quiet, and so they could control the environment a little bit more. On the first Saturday, they had the students go there, and what was there is there was just some white guys and girls sitting at the entrance of the door, and they didn't interact with them at all. They didn't do anything that was that would denote prejudice. They were just standing there, and they gave a test of cognition. It's a kind of an intelligence test that you read something and then you have to rationally provide what was going on in the story. It's a pretty close to what you would do with a standardized IQ test. In fact, they're correlated really highly with each other. And on that first Saturday, those students scored what was predicted. Let's say, if the high number was 100, they scored around a 60. And that was very what you would call stereotypical for that group. The interesting thing was the second Saturday. On the second Saturday, there was no students, white, black, Latino, anything. And the test person that was giving the test was also just was a black male. Okay. And what was interesting on that second Saturday is all of those inner city black students scored the same as someone attending Stanford because they had a control group. They gave the test to a whole bunch of the Stanford students. But when there wasn't that environmental constraint, such as feeling like you're less than or feeling like you're being prejudiced against just by other people standing there, those students scored the exact same as the Stanford students. My point being is that intelligence is malleable, it's changeable, and it is also based on the situation that you're in and what you allow yourself to be. Okay. Um, Probably my example of this is I'm first generational, and I come from a very impoverished background. And you can ask my wife today when we go visit my family, she's like, my language changes. It's like I get regressed. I act like the little brother and all of those things. And so my point being is even though I'm teaching a college course, there's situations that I'm put in that you wouldn't even think I had a college degree. So that's the point of the situation, what it determines when it comes to the individual. Mistakes children make are usually meaningful because the mistakes give us insight into the nature of their thought processes. And this is an important issue because we've had we've had for a couple decades something called helicopter parents. And the way I'm defining helicopter parents is it's that parent that is always there to make sure nothing bad happens in that child's world. It's almost like they're trying to wrap them in bubble wrap. And we've had these kiddos coming up into the ranks, and from a cognitive level, those kids who have had that helicopter parent tend to be about 2 to 3 years behind their peers cognitively. And this was the point that Jean Piaget was making. Our children need to make mistakes. They need to have ouchies and oohs and oh no moments because that's how we learn and that's how we grow and that's how we develop. And so as parents, as Jean Piaget would have put it, the job of the parent is to allow their children to make mistakes safely. All right. And that's what he would argue that that's the point of parents. And now that we've had a couple decades of helicopter parents who are over controlling of their child's life, we're finding that there's some validity to what Piaget was saying. As children develop, the structure of their thinking changes and their new modes of thought are based on earlier structures. And I think this is kind of a no-duh concept is that we build our knowledge over time. We're not born with knowledge. Knowledge is something that is built. And so things become, if we look at it from a genetic perspective or from a species specific perspective, all species go from something simple to complex as they develop over time. And we can see this through the lifespan, but we can also see this over over time, over centuries. And so over evolutionary time. Usually an organism will start with something simple and then over the evolutionary time become more and more complex. We also during our lifespan tend to go from something simple to complex. Now, I think I brought this up when we were going through this theory, but I promised that we would be emphasizing it a little bit more. And this is the concept of schemas, okay? A schema is our generalization for a given thing, okay, or experience. So we all have probably schemas of what a birthday should look like, what a funeral should look like, what a Monday should look like. Um, we have a schema for what a child should look like, an adult, and so on, so on, so on. But the important thing to keep in mind with schemas is that they are a generalization. So it makes navigating our world more and more simple because we're able to put things into categories. And so what Piaget thought is our schemas um, go through what's something called assimilation. So for example, in the example it's given on the slide, Annie learns what a dog is. And so she has a schema, even though we have small dogs, big dogs, medium-sized dogs, active dogs, and we all have this knowledge of when we look at a dog, it's a dog. And so we do that. So when she sees a cat, she calls it a dog because if you look, they have pointy ears, snouts, all of these things. But if the schema does not fit the experience, this is when we go through what Piaget said is disequilibrium. Because even though dogs and cats have similar features, we all know they behave much different than each other. Even down to the way their ears and their nose and the way they walk, they're very two different species. And so when we come across this, we can instantly think that a cat is a dog, but then we start to experience the differences between the two. And so we go through disequilibrium. And during this, we then create a different schema for a cat. Children organize, of course, as schemas, cognitive frameworks that let us put in categories. But then when we and then when we have a new experience, so Annie learns that there are similar kinds of animals and other kinds of cats and dogs. This creates equilibrium, equilibration, resolving in disequilibrium. So when we have in, I need to go back here. I skipped. Accommodation is when we have to adjust our schemas based on new information. So even though these three dogs look different, we accommodate them into the same category as a dog because they're not too unsimilar from each other to create new categories such as a poodle or I don't know what this little guy is, retriever. Even though we can differentiate them at that time, we still categorize or schema these as dogs. Okay. Now, if you remember what Piaget argued is that this phase of development is what we call the sensory motor phase. And in this stage, the infant understands the world as it takes it through their senses. Now, and as we'll discuss later, one of the big difficulties of Piaget's theory is it didn't take into account any of the internal processes that infants go through. So we're talking about this from a behavioral perspective. And he argued that there are four general trends in development. One is from reflexes, so reaching out and grabbing a bottle and doing the sucking reflex on it to goal-directed activities. And we do this from the body to the outside world. And the point of this phase is really, according to Piaget, is to develop object permanence, to be able to mentally represent motor actions and mental representations. So the goal of this phase, according to Piaget, is to interact with that world and then come with mental representations such as schemas so that we can then go on and develop in the next phase, a symbolic phase, right? Where we start to symbolize everything from based on our interaction with the world. So this is kind of the stages we know about when it comes to reflexes and those kinds of things. So we know use of reflexes 0 to 1 is these are going to be automatic reflexes. So if you just gently rub an infant's cheek, it will instantly start doing the sucking motions. And so, but that's not something that is controlled by the infant. It's something that will happen automatically. And then we go from 1 to 4 months where we go through what we call a primary circular phase. This is when adaptations of the reflex to the environment. So the infant might adjust their sucking to accommodate, for example, a pacifier, okay, which is a different type of a sucking reflex. It's not the automatic one that we had when we were 0 to 1 months of age. And then we do go into what's called a secondary circular reaction. This is around 4 to 8 months, where repetition of action that makes interesting events last. So this is when an infant swings their arm and it happens to hit a bell, they'll repeat that action many times, okay? And then from there, from about 8 to 12 months, we go through coordination of reaction and application to new situations. So this is when action schemas, so schemas for a situation start to happen. And this is when an infant taps a bell and it rings and tries to tap a new object to see if it'll do the same thing. So they know that stimuli, bell, makes that bell sound, so they then go test that on other objects around them. And then tertiary circular reactions, 12 to 18 months, is intentional discovery of new means to explore. So the toddler rings a bell and discover hitting the bell with a stick also makes it ring, but it's a slightly different type of ring. Okay, so now we're using objects to explore the world as well. And then in the 6th stage, which happens between about 18 to 24 months, is the invention of new means of exploring. So this is when the child is starting to be able to mentally represent their world. So in this example, the toddler sees a cracker on the table and pulls the chair over to climb up and get it. So there's this goal-directed behavior that didn't need a previous schema to achieve. They just realized the chair will get me higher and put me closer to the cracker. So then they initiate that behavior, okay? Now, it has been since Piaget and since we started looking at the internal workings of a child, we think that there is what's called a theory of core knowledge. And this theory basically says there are certain knowledge that we're innate with and is built in. So we know, reflexes are, for example, something that is there, it's innate, we're born with it. Since about 2007 with Splitz and Kinsler, we found that there's some necessary knowledge that is innate, that we're born with, that help us then build the rest of our knowledge, the rest of our schemas or the way we present the world. So in this, infants look longer at events that are a violation of expectation, okay? So, and I think we got I'll show you this in just an example, but according to these two psychologists, knowledge that an object moves as a cohesive unit, it does not contact another object unless they are close to each other, okay? We're also born with knowledge that agents, people, act with purposeful and goal-directed behavior. It's also assumed that we have a knowledge within limitations of numbers. Now, since this 2007, we actually have found infants actually have a very complex understanding of numbers. They actually can predict probability better than most adults. And we have knowledge of spatial relationships, Okay. And so probably one of the examples that is used is we know in this top figure that this is something that is possible, that if you have an object on top of an object and you move that across to the other, that's we know that can happen. However, if you look at this impossible event, so we have this at its edge and then we push it over and there's nothing underneath it to support it. The interesting thing is infants actually understand this. They will stare and look at why this is happening, because they know it's not possible. Okay. And it's believed that we're born with this idea, that we're born with the idea of gravity and all of those things. So when an infant sees a violation like this, they'll try and figure it out why this object is not obeying the kind of the laws of gravity. And I'll tell you in these experiments, it's because this is usually, it has metal on the back, and then there's a magnet. Well, no, it's a magnet, and then in the back there's metal. And so we push it over, like shown in the graph, and it's actually because there's a magnet on the back of it that keeps it that way. But we're curious, what's the infant going to do? Because, they probably have no idea that there's a magnet. And so just to bring that up, this is why we make these impossible events, and we're learning that infants understand that there's things that should not be possible. And we believe that's part of our core knowledge. Okay. Now, we know that infants learn through the three types of conditioning learning. So you probably remember from Introduction to Psychology, classical conditioning is what's called associative learning. So it's when we learn that a bottle can be drank out of because of the associations we make. I'm trying to think of a better example. Well, as adults, when we walk into a kitchen, we probably all start to salivate. When we walk into our bedroom, we probably all, I don't know, tend to start getting a little bit tired. Okay. And this is the example of classical conditioning, it's what we call associative learning. And that's why, just some study advice. This is why if you're studying for an exam, you shouldn't eat anything. You shouldn't have any snacks around you, because what you're learning is being associated with that snack. And then when you go take that test in the class, you'll do less well because you don't have that snack with you. And that's another example kind of on the college level or high school level of classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is reward and punishment. So when we're rewarded for doing a behavior, we're more likely to do that in the future. When we're punished for a behavior, we're less likely to do that in the future. And that's kind of a easy. Imitation is also something, if you remember when we started the class, infants start to imitate at a very young age. If you remember the example of the little Albert experiment, where the infant imitated the reaction it should have due to the symbol that was going on. Infants will imitate the mom when you go through that kind of mother infant dance after feeding or changing or comforting the infant. And so these are the primary ways that infants start to learn. Okay. And I do need to put just a note in here. This imitation, for most species, is innate, meaning that the species will do what mom does, not because they go, oh, that's interesting what mom is doing. No, they do it because it's innate. It triggers a genetic part of them that goes, I'm supposed to be doing this. But when it comes to humans and some of our closer cousins, like the elephant and the dolphin and the apes and monkeys of the world, we do something different. because imitation is not something that we then just do. It's not something that is what you would say innate in us. No, we have the ability to watch mom, watch dad, watch auntie, watch grandpa, and we're able to take all of those behaviors and combine them into a new, unique behavior to ourselves. So when we're talking about imitation, it's not that thing that you see on the Nature Channel where the young wolf is, playing with its brother and then it watches mom go hunt and all those things. Because in that case, they can only imitate the behavior that is being presented, that one single behavior. For humans and some of our closer, we can combine different behaviors to create a new one. So just kind of keep that in mind when we're thinking about imitation when it comes to adults. Okay. Now, what about attention and memory? Okay. Attention in infancy, we know that it tends to be we know there's selective and sustained attention. But the thing that we do know about infants is they lack the capacity to do what's called controlled attention. So selective attention is when an infant has a preference, for example, mom's face, mom's voice over a stranger's voice. Sustained attention is when the infant is able to do something for a sustained amount of time. So the best example is feeding. The infant is able to be there for that time of period and sustain the attention of feeding until it's done. What's the difference, though, is controlled attention. Controlled attention is, for example, take your most boring class, okay? But you have to get through that class. So you provide controlled attention. It might be a subject you just don't like at all. Maybe the teacher is a really boring teacher, but you're able to have that controlled attention because you have to get through that class, if that makes sense. We have found that infants kind of lack this ability to have very controlled attention towards an object, okay? We also know that infants are attracted to novelty, okay? So they get really interested when something new comes in the room. And they respond, but they also go through what we all go through as habituation at the beginning, they'll be really attracted to something novel. Maybe it's a new toy or something, but over time they habituate to it, meaning they become less and less interested. It becomes less and less novel. This is something that we do throughout our lifespan. So it's not unique to infants, but it is something that they tend to be born with. As far as memory in infancy, we have, based on the tests that we're able to do, we find that a 3-month-old can remember up to 1 week. And once we get up to 18 months of age, we can measure up, we can remember things up to about 13 weeks. And this is done through a test called the Magic Shrinking Machine. And I think I have a picture of it. No, I don't. The magic shrinking machine is when you have an object, you put it in it, and you pull out a smaller but similar object out the other end. Okay, that sounded weird. So let's say you put a soccer ball in one side, and in the back side you pull out a tennis ball. Okay, what we find is that children up to 3 months will remember that up to 1 week. 18 months will remember that experience up to 13 weeks. Okay. Now, I think I kind of mentioned this at the beginning of this class, but we also have something called infantile amnesia, meaning that majority of everyone can't remember what happened to them post 3 years of age, pre 3 years of age. And yes, I have ran into individuals who say they remember being born, they remember their first 6 months. But when we actually go and measure these individuals, it's because they've been told that story by their parents over and over and over their lifespan, that they think they could remember being born, but what they had was that story being told to them over and over and over. So for the majority of us, if we're not told about our infancy, we tend to have what's called infantile amnesia, which is this inability to remember anything before the age of 3. And if you remember, the current theory of why we have infantile amnesia is, if you remember, it was in the beginning of the class, I mentioned that infants, even when they're born, can feel pain. They can feel it in the womb. And if you think about this very fragile phase of life, all this sensory stuff, being born and everything, probably creates an incredible amount of pain. And so we think, this is the current theory. I'm saying it's a theory, it's not fact, it's not. We think we have infantile amnesia because because the brain is set to such a stage that it doesn't want to re-experience that physical pain you went through between the age of 0 and 3. That's the current theory. There's a lot of other theories too, but that's kind of the one that is predominant right now. We also know that infants, I mentioned this before, they do really well at things like probabilities and numbers. And these actually need to be updated this on your slide. So I'm going to give you the updated amounts. So we know that categorization actually happens sometime after birth. And this is kind of we're told we're born without prejudice, but we kind of are, because as early as 2 weeks of an age, infants will show a preference for individuals who are the same skin color as mom, and they will not have a preference for individuals who have a different skin color. And so it's about this is why we need to update this. At 6 weeks of age, we see infants categorizing things based on differences that they're experiencing for. So I really should just correct these slides. So this is actually 6 weeks of age. We found that infants can put things in simple categories. Development of numbers and concepts. This is another slide that information that needs to be updated, is the understanding of numbers up to at least 3. We actually can have at 6 months of age, there's been current research that shows infants can categorize things up to about 24 different objects. So they could put them in categories and they understand the limits and the numbers of that. Executive functions such as inhibition to develops around 2 years of age. Inhibition is the ability to not have instant gratification for something. So we find that infants around 24 months of age start to be able not to need the instant gratification of being fed or being changed or warmth. Okay, so, but that starts around 2 years of age. We also know around 2 years of age, we start to use your words and we start to see the development of the prefrontal cortex. But it's far from fully developed, but we see that it's starting into its developmental phase. Again, around 6 months to about a year of age is when we start to see the prefrontal cortex. And just as a reminder, the prefrontal cortex allows us to do logic. It allows us to do complex tasks, all those kinds of things. So we see this start to develop in infancy, but it's right now, current research shows that the prefrontal cortex does not become fully developed on average until about the age of 26, 27 years of age. So that's something to think about. All right, gang. Oh, I wanted to get further than this. Let me see. Hold on just a second. No, this is gonna take longer. Darn it. Yeah. Okay, gang, I'm gonna actually stop right here because the next thing we need to talk about is